Something I've been trying to do recently is eliminate what I call my cinematic blind spots. Everyone has them, whether you're an avid movie watcher or not. Certain directors, eras in time, genres, or even countries that just fly under our radar for one reason or another. And even though I still have many blind spots to check, I always considered my biggest one to be one man. Well, more specifically, one man with 6 faces. Yes, believe it or not, until very recently, I hadn't seen any of the James Bond movies. Well, technically, I saw Skyfall when it came out, and I think I saw Spectre, but as you can tell, they didn't make a huge impression. But I've always been really curious about the Bond franchise, given the fact that this character has survived and thrived in pop culture for so long. Also, these movies basically invented the spy adventure genre, or at least perfected it, and whether it's earnest or a parody, every post-Dr. No spy movie owes something to Bond. Also, even though multiple actors have taken on the role over the years, behind the scenes, Bond has stayed mostly in the same creative hands since the 1960s, which is incredibly rare among franchises of this size. Even more rare is that Bond himself has always essentially stayed the same. He's been rebooted and reinvented, but not like Spider-Man. From beginning to end, Bond has been the same Bond. So recently, I watched all 24 of the mainline Eon Productions Bond movies to get a better sense of where the franchise started and how it changed and became what it is today. So, let's talk about, every Bond movie, I guess. And what better place to start than with the first one they made? Makes sense to me. Going into the Connery movies, I wasn't really sure what to expect. I don't know much about comparable 60s action franchises like this, so my mind was as open as possible. More than anything, I hoped that these early Bond movies, which are generally considered to be classics, didn't just get that reputation through nostalgia. And luckily, nostalgia is just one factor of why these movies still resonate, because they're just great. My first thought when I finished this era of Bond was, oh, now I understand Austin Powers. And my second thought was, thank God this Bond experiment will actually be interesting. Sean Connery starred in 6 Bond movies between 1963 and 1971, starting with Dr. No, From Russia with Love, Goldfinger, Thunderball, and You Only Live Twice. Then George Lazenby briefly took over the role for On Her Majesty's Secret Service before Connery returned for his final appearance in Diamonds Are Forever. Well, not technically his final appearance, but Never Say Never Again is really boring, and the only reason that movie was even made was because Ian Fleming had a terrible grasp on intellectual property law, and there was this whole kerfuffle about the rights to Thunderball. Speaking of which, I'd like to give a shout out to this book. I read it along with my Bond marathon, and it really deepened the experience. The book is Some Kind of Hero by Matthew Field and A.J. Chowdhury. It's a movie-by-movie look at every single Bond movie's production, from Dr. No to Spectre, even including Never Say Never Again. It's filled with tons of behind-the-scenes info, interviews, and just fascinating backstory to how these movies were made. If you're a Bond fan at all, pick this book up. You will enjoy it. As for the movies, like I said, they're pretty great, or at least most of them are. The key factor of that greatness is Sean Connery through and through. I was aware that Sean Connery was a good actor because I've seen movies, but he's just incredible as Bond. He has this air of complete confidence and control. The way he moves and speaks is so smooth, so effortless, like he knows exactly what's going to happen and is already a step ahead. And the way Connery is able to shift across Bond's personality from light to dark, charming to threatening, lover to killer, it's just so much fun to watch. And even though he only rarely dips into it, the cold brutality of Bond is so crucial to the character. I think the movies need these reminders that for as much fun as he's having, and the audience is having, Bond is still a killing machine.
Mr. Smith & Wesson, and you've had your 6.
Even for someone as blind to this franchise as me, as I was watching Dr. No, I was thinking, this is exactly what this character should be. That performance and that presence, even in the weaker movies, was still really engaging. As for the movies themselves, there was a little less consistency at times. For the most part, though, the one word I would use to describe all of them is charming. Something about them, the age, the style, the iconography, it all just feels so classic.
On the side here, flat throwing knife. Press that button there. Now she comes.
It's not hard to see why these movies were so immediately and incredibly successful. At their best, they're everything you'd want from this genre. They're pure escapism, and never really trying to be anything more. Everything is heightened and definitely goofy, but rarely outright stupid, which is a very thin line that spy movies often have to walk. And surprisingly, although things do escalate movie by movie, the Connery films start out fairly grounded, if not realistic, which are two very different things. But I never really wanted realism because Bond thrives in this heightened world. He's a superhero, he's not Jason Bourne. The priority is the adventure, the colorful villains, the beautiful love interests, the exotic locations, the inventive action. The world of Bond is one that's built for fun. And even though it's easy to look back and chuckle at the more dated elements, these are still mostly really fun movies. Honestly though, I found those dated elements to be more fascinating than anything. It's just so far removed from what you see in modern action movies. It's a real glimpse into the time period.
But first, you must become Japanese.
Gombawa.
Konbanwa.
The different directorial approaches also gave some surprising versatility to the franchise. I had a very narrow idea of what the Bond movies would be before I started watching them, and while I wasn't entirely wrong about that, I was happy that they weren't quite as repetitive as I expected. Terrence Young had a way of making small stakes and simple action feel so big and bombastic, while Guy Hamilton leaned more into the silly aspects of the world to various degrees of success. Lewis Gilbert made the world of Bond feel so huge, bringing a level of spectacle that outshines modern blockbusters, and Peter Hunt played with a more stripped-down approach while being knowingly silly. All of these styles really worked for me. I can't pick a favorite, and at their best, these movies intrigued me, excited me, and always left me wanting more. Once I was hooked on Bond, I was really hooked. However, despite how much I enjoyed them at their best, the movies did occasionally sink down to their worst.
If God had wanted man to fly,
he would have given him wings.
Which honestly surprised me a bit. Not because some of the movies were bad, that's just inevitable with any franchise of this size, and I knew I wouldn't like every single one of them. But the things I disliked about the weaker films were based on the same basic pieces that made up the ones I loved, and not just in terms of comparison. Which brings us, of course, to the part of the franchise that everyone loves talking about, the Bond formula. I don't really feel the need to explain or dissect the Bond formula, because if you watched 3 random Bond movies, you'd get it. Every Bond movie basically works the same way, and that's very much by design. But what I find interesting about the formula is just how much can be done with it narratively, and what a delicate balance it has to strike for a movie to really work. The Bond girls, the gadgets, the villains, the henchmen, the action, the locations, it seems easy, but if any of those elements are out of whack, it can throw off the entire movie. In a way, while I obviously wish the movies I didn't like were better, I was glad to get a sense of a spectrum of quality, so I wouldn't idealize this version of Bond or blame future movies' failures on a lack of Connery alone. Connery can save a lot, but he can't save everything. He could not save Diamonds Are Forever. Ironically, though, the most interesting of these Bond movies didn't even have Connery in it. That's right, it's time to talk about the Australian bodybuilder in the room, simultaneously the most unremarkable and remarkable Bond of all, George Lazenby. On Her Majesty's Secret Service is a very strange entry in this franchise because even though it's definitely part of an ongoing story, it feels so singular. Maybe it was because Lazenby never came back, but I'm more inclined to say it was because of Peter Hunt's direction. This movie has some of the best Bond stuff in the entire series. The locations are stunning, the editing is kind of experimental and weird at times, but I liked it, and the love story is the most important of the entire franchise outside Casino Royale. It even has a climactic bobsled chase, which every movie should have, but crucially, it has a much more personally focused story and character-driven stakes. Bond goes on a typical Bond adventure, yes, and he fights Blofeld and all that, but his relationship with Tracy shows a much more compelling side of the character. That relationship gives Bond some true vulnerability, and after a series of crazy adventures with disposable love interests, he gains something to lose beyond his own life. So when he does lose it so quickly and because of who he is, it really hits because you can see that glimpse at humanity get yanked away, and you get the sense that Bond can never truly get back there.
There's no hurry, you see. We have all the time in the world.
And then the movie just ends, and I didn't cry at all. I really like seeing Bond form those more personal connections, because once you start to see the patterns of the movies, it can feel like he's just going through the motions at times. And those connections don't just shine with love interests. The rivalry Bond has with Goldfinger throughout that movie makes their eventual showdown all the more impactful, instead of him just feeling like another evil guy Bond has to stop. In a weird way, I'm kind of glad that only a few of these movies really pushed those ideas. It helped them stand out among the more episodic movies. I mean, I'm sure they tried to make them all great, but oops. I was also really interested by how the franchise's overarching story was constructed movie to movie, where Spectre is this constant threat after it's introduced, but the movies take their time building up to actually revealing Blofeld and giving Bond his true nemesis. It was surprisingly patient, and it was funny to compare it to a blockbuster landscape obsessed with trying to build franchises from the get-go, and see that they were doing a better job of it in the 60s. I was really impressed by how these 7 movies covered so much ground while still feeling so coherent. Even the ones I didn't like had their merits and their moments of fun. And when all the movies are really trying to be our fun spy adventures, it's hard to hold much against them. I mean, you could hold the fact that they're extremely dated against them, like, you know.
But first, you must become Japanese.
But it was the 1960s. Things in movies were different. This is not news.
Dink, say goodbye to Felix. Man talk.
Also, Connery's wearing a pretty good wig in these movies, but once you see the wig, you can't unsee the wig. If I had to pick a favorite movie of this era, it would be From Russia with Love. It was a simple, low-stakes adventure that felt huge. It had a fantastic villain and love interest. Just everything I love about the early Bond movies is at its best here. Also, Roald Dahl wrote You Only Live Twice. Yeah, like Roald Dahl. I just thought that was a fun fact. Overall, I had a lot of fun with the Connery movies. They were the perfect introduction to this series and this genre, and although I was sad to see Connery go, I was curious to see what another actor would bring to the character. Well, another other actor, I mean. So, even though Sean Connery's tenure as Bond ended with a bit of a whimper with Diamonds Are Forever, Roger Moore's was just beginning, and that's a whole other story. Even though Connery is the template for James Bond in many ways, the movies I was most familiar with through cultural osmosis mostly starred Roger Moore. So, going into the Moore era, I was curious to see not only how Moore defined his version of Bond, but also how the movies would feel as they reinvented themselves across a new decade. Roger Moore starred in 7 Bond movies between 1973 and 1985. Live and Let Die, The Man with the Golden Gun, The Spy Who Loved Loved Me, Moonraker, For Your Eyes Only, Octopussy, and A View to a Kill. What became immediately apparent about Moore is that his take on Bond was far less serious than Connery's, which very much reflected the stories he was a part of. The Moore films are much more overtly goofy than in the previous era. I mean, the bar for goofiness was already pretty low, but still, a more comedic, lighthearted spin on the Bond formula was very prevalent, and the movies were pushed into the realm of being cartoonish a little too often. First it's little things like jumping on some alligator heads, and then suddenly it's Moonraker, just all of Moonraker. And I'm fine with goofiness. With Bond, I embrace it, but Bond himself plays a very important role in establishing tone. And because Moore's Bond rarely seems to take anything seriously, it's hard to get invested in what's happening, because Bond just becomes this cartoon man who can never actually be in danger. And Bond should be on top of things, or even superhuman at times, but invulnerable doesn't quite work for me. There are exceptions to this cartoonish tone, but seeing Moore display any real vulnerability is very rare, and you can find those moments if you really look, but in the big picture of Roger Moore's tenure, he wasn't a very grounded Bond, especially with the womanizing and the one-liners cranked up to 11.
A genuine Felix Leiter. Illuminating.
Speaking of womanizing, Moore was the first Bond to very noticeably age out of the role by the end of his tenure. He mostly gets away with it, but the charming aspects of Bond started to read as a bit creepy after a while. In For Your Eyes Only, the age disparity with the love interest is very noticeable, and by A View to a Kill, he just kind of looks like a confused old man who's running around and trying to kill Christopher Walken. This Bond was missing that undercurrent of darkness, that sense that he could switch off the charm and become a killer when he needed to be. Even when he was killing people, it felt kind of posed and unthreatening. And while the character's lightness and charm are key to what makes Bond so fun, I did miss that darkness. Without it, Bond just kind of seems like a horny guy who likes dressing up as a clown and shooting people.
Thank you very much. You did a great job, sir.
Of all the Bond eras, this is the one that bled together the most for me. If you were to ask me which villain or love interest was in a given movie, I would probably get most of them wrong. Except, of course, the always wonderful Christopher Lee as the man with the golden gun and also 3 nipples, because that movie really reinforced that that guy had 3 nipples more than was necessary, I'd argue, but the real reason why they bleed together is because I saw almost all of Moore's movies as just fine, and only occasionally dipping above or below average. They had their moments, and they were generally cute and fun, but they felt like they were missing something, or they dropped the ball on some interesting potential. However, there was the same interesting variety to be found in the different directors. The era started off on a bit of an awkward foot under Guy Hamilton, then went in some visually striking but awkward directions under Lewis Gilbert's return, and then found a more low-key, consistent rhythm under John Glenn. I think John Glenn's direction fits this version of Bond the best, and even though his last couple movies were kinda slow, Moore really shined at Glenn's best. Glenn has such a creative eye for setting and environments in action sequences. It was never just guns and judo chops with him. The most repetitive aspect of Moore's Bond was his relationships with the Bond girls. They made for some fun banter by starting out more contentious, but eventually I was just waiting for whoever it was in a given movie to fall in love with him. That's how I describe most of the romantic connections in these movies. Bond rarely seemed to care one way or the other, and the older he got, the less believable it was that these women just kept throwing themselves at him. The most interesting romantic dynamic was with Triple X in The Spy Who Loved Me. I like seeing a Bond girl that feels more like an equal, but nothing ever hit as hard as Bond and Tracy. Man, I wish Connery had been in that movie. Can you imagine how good it would have been? Also, I was really glad to see that Tracy wasn't forgotten by this franchise, and even though the Bond continuity is loose, to say the least. Moments like this helped build on that unique cohesion that Bond has. It's like whenever they reboot Batman in the comics but keep all his lore. If you want to believe this character has had a realistic lifespan, then the depth of his history really makes no sense, but who cares if those moments and stories still work? Tonally, there was a very noticeable escalation into silliness across the movies after Live and Let Die, and an even more noticeable attempt to scale things back after Moonraker. I personally prefer the movies scaled back, and I liked seeing more with some grit, but it never took long for things to get silly again. But that's not to say that I thought these movies were all just stupid and I checked out or anything. This era still had a lot to love. It had the strongest theme songs by far, and always boasted really impressive production design, action sequences, and stunts. But those can really only get you so far, and I found myself longing for a more grounded, character-driven tone to balance out the goofy adventures. And what makes it all the more frustrating is that there's a lot of potential buried beneath the goofiness, but it's still buried. For Your Eyes Only was the only movie that really gave me that balance, and it proved that Moore could really shine as Bond in a smaller, scrappier story. And that's why it was my favorite movie of this era. It was a breath of fresh air in the midst of the Moore silliness. It was exciting, tense, and a ton of fun. At its worst, the Moore era was just kind of boring, but personally, I think the worst thing a Bond movie can be is boring. So, after I finished the Moore films, I was excited and nervous. While I was definitely ready for a change, the movies were starting to feel a little samey, and I was worried that if the next Bond wasn't an interesting or distinct enough reinvention, then this whole Bond experiment would fall apart and I'd be stuck watching a bunch of boring movies I wasn't really that interested in anymore. Thankfully, my worries were in vain, because Timothy Dalton is a king, and he would never disappoint me or anyone else. Going into the Dalton movies, I knew next to nothing about this version of Bond. I think Dalton gets overlooked a bit in the big picture of the franchise, which is a shame because I think he had the strongest run of any Bond actor. And sure, his run was only 2 movies long, so the odds are a little stacked, but still. Yes, Timothy Dalton only starred in 2 Bond movies from 1987 to 1989, The Living Daylights and License to Kill, both directed by John Glenn, and both of which I loved. This was definitely the reinvention I was hoping for, taking Bond back to basics, keeping the action simple and the emotion focused. Dalton brought out a very different side of Bond, one that was much more human and fallible, even showing some desperation when he was backed into a corner. That's very much reflected in the scale of the movies, which can still feel appropriately big for Bond, but never Moonraker big. The tone makes all the difference, and these films were much more grounded. Dalton was a far cry from Moore. The womanizing was dialed way back and used much more purposefully. This Bond used his charm as a tool, not as a default personality. And surprisingly, I did end up missing that charm a bit. Dalton isn't one to make a bunch of puns, and the rare times he does crack a real Bond joke, it's delivered much more deadpan and casual.
Better make that 2.
Little touches like that really helped to define these different Bonds, and it gave the sense that there isn't just one right way to play him. The character can be many things and still work. Which is not to say that the typical Bond elements weren't present in the Dalton movies, they were just toned way down. These movies were still a ton of fun for the same reasons that other Bond movies are fun. But thankfully, they didn't just feel like Roger Moore movies with someone else in them. They took a lot of cues from other 80s action movies and built a very different atmosphere. As had been proven with For Your Eyes Only, John Glenn's style works fantastically with a more grounded story, and aesthetically, thematically, and tonally, these movies were emblematic of everything I love about this decade and action.
Another $80 million write-off!
I guess it's time to start turning overhead.
Bond's motivations in these movies came from a more personal place, as opposed to him just doing his job. The idea of revenge was central to this Bond, which is also very 80s. I also really enjoyed the way these movies played with the strange, undefined continuity of the Bond series, where everything that's happened to Bond has vaguely happened at some point, but it doesn't really matter when. And with Bond, that history just makes the best moments of the franchise carry more weight.
He was married once, but it was a long time ago.
Speaking of which, I wasn't too invested in the actual relationships Bond was involved in across these movies, and the villains weren't that memorable, but I was still really swept up in the adventure, the action, and the tension. In the end, picking a favorite movie of this era was very easy, as my options were, limited. License to Kill just edged it out, though. It was really the shot in the arm I needed to carry me through to the next Bond with no concerns. When I knew the movies could be this good after this long, it was easy to stay optimistic. Finishing these movies and knowing that a new Bond was coming up so quickly made me a little disappointed, because I would have loved to see a couple more movies with Dalton, with this tone and this vibe. But we were leaving the grim, gritty 80s and entering the 90s, which spelled another reinvention for Bond. A reinvention which, well, it was something. Let's talk about Pierce Brosnan. Now that Bond had been through a few iterations on screen, I was starting to get a better sense of the character's patterns. Going into the Brosnan movies, I really knew nothing about them besides them having a mostly underwhelming reputation and that the guy from Mamma Mia who can't sing plays Bond. Turns out, I wasn't far off. Pierce Brosnan starred in 4 Bond movies from 1995 to 2002. GoldenEye, Tomorrow Never Dies, The World Is Not Enough, and Die Another Day. Brosnan's take on the character was definitely a return to the more traditional portrayal of Bond, the charismatic gentleman spy, and he felt much more in line with more than Dalton. This era as a whole felt like a tonal reset from grim 80s action. The movies were distinctly more lighthearted and over the top. And like the Moore era, things started off okay, but quickly devolved into ridiculous nonsense. Honestly, I really wasn't a fan of these movies. They all struck me as just kind of okay, and even the best of them I just enjoyed enough to consider them good Bond movies, not quite great ones. The Bond formula also came back in full force, and like the later Moore movies, the ways it manifested in the stories ranged from distracting to outright annoying. The most famous of these is, of course, Denise Richards as Christmas Jones, a character name that really should have been vetoed in the screenplay stage. Denise Richards wasn't even that bad, just really out of place. These movies have a lot of strange ideas bashing up against each other, and at times it felt like they were just throwing everything at the wall and seeing what stuck.
I thought Christmas only comes once a year.
And, like I said about the Bond formula, if one element is off, everything gets thrown off, and the Brosnan era was chock full of things that felt off. And Brosnan as Bond reflected the movies in general. He was just fine. Nothing about his take on Bond struck me as particularly memorable or interesting. He wasn't bad, he looked the part and was clearly having a ton of fun with it. He was just less defined. It all just felt a little too refined, a little too smooth, and as the movies went on, this Bond became more and more of a caricature.
I see you handle your weapon well.
I have been known to keep my tip up.
And again, I'm fine with the goofy stuff. I still like a fun spy adventure, but the movies all struck me as either kind of boring or kind of stupid, so I didn't have much to fall back on. There were a few moments where the underlying darkness of the character shone through, but these movies mostly felt like Bond shooting and humping his way through some really silly stuff. Also, every movie in the Brosnan era had a different director, with Martin Campbell, Roger Spottiswoode, Michael Apted, and Lee Tomatori tackling these stories. Obviously, each of these movies had different approaches and stylistic flourishes, but maybe because none of the directors came back within this era, and the films felt more homogenous, none of them made too big of an impression, except Tomatori, who took Die Another Day in some very memorable directions. Still, the Brosnan era does feel somewhat by the numbers, lacking a distinct voice that really made the stories click, maybe because the stories were mostly dumb. Like with Roger Moore, each movie just got progressively more and more ridiculous until we reached the plot description of Bond fights a North Korean who changes his race with DNA surgery in order to use a giant laser satellite to blow up the landmines in the DMZ and invade South Korea. That actually is the real plot to a real movie. The bad guy also has a robot suit that shoots lightning. That gradual escalation into silliness also affected the villains, the love interests, the gadgets. It just infected everything. I don't know, I just felt so passive while watching these movies. Nothing about them really grabbed me, and like I've said, the worst thing a Bond movie can be is boring. At least Die Another Day went so insane that it was a fun ride. I can't say I had too much fun with the rest of these movies. It's not like nothing interesting was done in the pursuit of keeping Bond updated and modern. The introduction of Judi Dench as M made Bond's connection with authority and women a little more compelling than just an exposition dump and some cute jokes. But this was not the kind of Bond I really connect with. It just felt like we've done this before, and maybe this series has been going on too long. In the end, my favorite movie of this era was, and this may be controversial, actually Tomorrow Never Dies. Bond's relationship with Wei Lin was great, it was ridiculous but still enjoyable, and I love me some Jonathan Pryce. No, it wasn't GoldenEye. Please save your outraged comments about how you can't believe I don't like GoldenEye that much. It does not matter. And with Brosnan's tenure at an end, a significant part of Bond's journey ended with him. The loose, undefined continuity that we'd been following since 1963 was about to be thrown away, with the next chapter of Bond films starting with an outright reboot. And frankly, I don't blame them for rebooting. I mean, after Die Another Day, wouldn't you? So, here we are in the modern day, with the first actor I ever knew as James Bond, Daniel Craig. Craig has starred in 4 Bond movies between 2006 and 2015, Casino Royale, Quantum of Solace, Skyfall, and Spectre. He's also starring in the upcoming No Time to Die, but who knows when that'll come out. Who knows when any movie will come out. Remember movie theaters? Remember Outside? To me, this was the most interesting era of Bond movies, on its own and in the context of the whole series. As I mentioned at the beginning of this video, I had seen a couple of these movies before, but my memories were hazy, and watching them with the rest of the franchise fresh in my brain recontextualized them completely. A big part of that was the portrayal of Bond. I think Craig is excellent in the role and does the best job of embodying all aspects of Bond since Connery. It was also nice to see a version of Bond that was so unashamedly crazy at times, because the real core of James Bond is that he's an insane person. You would have to be. The problem is that at this point, with Bond becoming such a common punching bag in pop culture, and generally becoming more of a household idea than a distinct character, like with Darth Vader, it wouldn't be misguided to worry about the franchise's continued relevance. Casino Royale gets around this very smartly by starting from the beginning, and giving the audience a story we'd truly never seen before, which is how Bond became Bond. Throughout the movie, we get glimpses at the Bond we're familiar with, and we see him go down a very similar path to On Her Majesty's Secret Service, with Vesper's final betrayal cementing his personality in the same way that Tracy's death did. This Bond is a weapon who started to feel like a human, and then that humanity was ripped away from him. It's tragic, fascinating, and if you watched Dr. No immediately after this, you'd understand exactly why this guy is the way he is.
The name's Bond. James Bond.
Casino Royale is a brilliant origin story, and a very complete one. At the end of the movie, he is Bond. But then, Quantum of Solace turned out to be a direct sequel to Casino Royale, and gave Bond closure for Vesper, because it turns out she was actually also being played, which kind of defeats the point of Casino Royale's ending, and then the gun barrel sequence happens at the end, so I guess he's Bond now? Well, then Skyfall came out and gave us even more Bond backstory, a new M, Moneypenny, Q, a return to a more fun, adventurous tone, and then the gun barrel sequence happened at the end again, so he's really Bond now, guys, I promise. And then Spectre opens with the gun barrel sequence and ends with Bond retiring. Did we miss a few movies? The critical flaw with the Craig films is that they want to have their cake and eat it too. They want a fresh start for Bond, but they're still relying on the emotional context of the character's entire history. And sure, every reboot does that to some degree, and there had been quite a bit of time and distance between certain Bond elements and the modern age, but it hadn't been 30 years since the last Bond movie before Casino Royale. It had been 4. Given how long James Bond has been around, if they had maintained the same loose continuity of the other Bond eras, then stories about him getting old and retiring would fit better than they do at the chosen points in this Bond story. Bond aging and losing his touch is a good idea for a Bond movie in general, but it makes very little sense as a sequel to Quantum of Solace. And having Bond jump from the brash young agent who doesn't play by the rules to the aging, over-the-hill veteran who has to prove himself in the span of just one movie creates whiplash. And maybe some people just don't care about any of that and just want to watch a good Bond movie, and that's totally cool. But the Craig movies decided that continuity matters now, and I like it when movies follow through on their narrative promises. And continuity isn't just about plot points lining up. Character also matters immensely. Maybe this was the result of trying to make a series of movies that felt like a distinct series and not just a bunch of episodic adventures, but the story is all over the place. In terms of direction, maybe one singular creative voice was what this reboot needed to give it that connective tissue rather than switching it up as they went. Since these movies are constructed one after the other, you'd think they would just keep pushing forward, but instead the sequels just constantly recontextualize what the last movie or movies tried to do.
I guess you have access to some very sensitive material, which you're going to be forced to give up.
And the more changes you retroactively make to a story, the more it feels like you don't really have faith in the story you're telling. Retcons have to be really good to work, and uh-oh.
It was all me, James. It's always been me, the author of all your pain.
In terms of direction, this era is also all over the place. Martin Campbell returned for Casino Royale and brought a much grittier post-Jason Bourne feel while maintaining a great sense of spectacle. Then Mark Forster came aboard and made one of the worst action movies I've ever seen. Then Sam Mendes took over for the last 2 films, and while he's great at visual spectacle and keeping things grounded, his movies are a little too dour for me. Sam Mendes doesn't make bad movies, but he also doesn't make what I would call fun movies. Skyfall and Spectre are also very self-reflexive and devote a lot of time to questioning the relevance of James Bond in the modern day.
We can't keep working in the shadows. There are no more shadows.
Come on, Em, you can't really tell me that one man in the field can compete with all of this, running around out there with his license to kill.
These are not subtle thematic ideas. There's almost a feeling of insecurity to it, and the way the Craig movies rely so heavily on the franchise's past just reinforces that. I don't want or need this level of continuity between Bond movies either. I like the more episodic nature of the pre-Craig films, where you can just kind of jump in anywhere and enjoy the ride. Also, as the Craig movies have tried to move towards a more light-hearted tone, that fixation on continuity and realistic reinvention proved to be more of a hindrance than anything. The apex of stupid, as I call it, comes in Spectre, when Blofeld returns to the franchise and turns out to be Bond's secret adoptive brother, and Spectre was actually behind everything that Bond's been through in every movie. Does this add anything, or even make sense when you think about the stories of the other movies for 3 seconds? Nope. Everyone's just Inspector now, I guess. Every single person James Bond has ever come across.
It's everywhere. Everywhere.
like I said, they were doing a better job of all this back in the 60s. Maybe there are just some things about Bond that can't be modernized. If they wanted to change Bond, truly change him, then Casino Royale was the template to build from. But Quantum of Solace proved that leaning too far into the gritty political intrigue stuff just makes the story feel like a generic 2000s action movie where anyone could be the protagonist. But to be fair, Quantum of Solace was made during the 2008 writer's strike, so you can only be so mean. It was kind of screwed. So Skyfall and Spectre pivoted back to a more traditional Bond tone, but I would say they overcorrected. Aside from Casino Royale, I think all of the Craig movies have fallen short of their thematic goals.
You don't trust anyone, do you, James?
No.
Then you've learnt your lesson.
I guess I wish that certain aspects of Bond had been left in the past. Those movies aren't just dated because they turned Bond into a Japanese guy. They're from a more earnest, pre-Austin Powers world. I think the Craig movies have been trying to combat or subvert that image, but in doing so, they feel like they're at war with themselves, and for all their impressive action, narratively, they've been spinning their wheels for so long. And yet, that never made me want to give up on Bond. I was so invested at this point that I just kept hoping for more. I think that's what keeps Bond relevant more than anything. Even though the movies all use the same basic pieces, there's so much that can be done with it all. If Daniel Craig's Bond has taught me anything, it's that things can change, but they don't need to be justified. I mean, they've been making Bond movies for almost 60 years now, and people aren't sick of it yet. I really hope that No Time to Die gives me what I wanted from the Craig era, which, ironically, ended up being a more traditional Bond movie. If things do go that way, I think this franchise's default settings may end up being refreshing. In the end, my favorite movie of this era was, shocking no one, Casino Royale. I think it's the masterpiece of the franchise, it's the perfect Bond movie to me, and I don't know how any future Bond movie could beat it, but I really hope they can. The Craig era isn't officially over yet, so I can't really make a conclusive statement about it, especially since the future of Bond and every other movie franchise is kind of up in the air right now, but I'm optimistic about No Time to Die, and I hope Daniel Craig leaves the role on a high note. I don't have the inside track, but I'm pretty sure Craig's not coming back after this one, and once he's free of Bond, he can return to his true passion, playing Southern weirdos.
Would you give me my arm, please?
Is it this one?
But we must look a little closer. And when we do, we see the donut hole has a hole in its center.
As for the future of Bond in general, I'm excited to see where the character goes next. Above all else, I hope we can see a return to the more episodic nature of the series and just have fun again. That is my most basic core desire from any Bond movie, so please give up on the lore, it doesn't matter. All I know is this. My Bond experiment paid off, and I am now firmly a fan of this franchise. Does the Bond franchise not have, like, a catchy nickname? Like, how, at this point? I can't think of one. Is there not, like, you know, like a Bond head or like a Bondian or something? I can't find anything. It was fascinating to see how Bond evolved over time and seeing filmmaking conventions and technology evolve with him while still retaining that same escapist spirit. A recurring aspect of these movies is how much changes and how much stays the same. But in the pursuit of constantly modernizing Bond, the core of his character has never truly been lost. And I think that's the real heart of Bond, the idea that even after all they've done and all this time, there is still so much that can be done with this character, and people are still so hungry for more. So for all of Skyfall and Spectre's questioning of his relevance, I think the world still has a place for that real, earnest, unashamedly goofy and fun James Bond. And if they're still looking for the next Bond after Craig, just cast Daniel Kaluuya, you cowards. And now I'm going to answer the question. The most important question in the entire Bond fan base, the one that I'm sure most, if not every viewer of this video will wonder in regards to its concept. The best Bond is Connery, but Dalton is my favorite. So, as I was wrapping up this script, Sean Connery passed away at the age of 90. that couldn't really go unacknowledged because his impact on Bond and film as a whole has been undeniable. His presence in Hollywood always felt enormous, and I think the reason why his loss resonated so much, even after such a long life, is because Connery himself was just such an endlessly wonderful presence on screen, and he brought something to characters like Bond that made them immediately iconic. No matter what the role was, Connery alone made it something truly special and endlessly memorable. He was on a level that few other actors have ever reached, and without hyperbole, he was just a legend. Connery was so much more than just James Bond, but that combination was just so magical, so perfect, and without it, I don't know where the James Bond movies would be. Definitely not in the same place, so I'm very grateful he was there to kick it off. So guys, those are my thoughts on every single Bond movie. Thank you very much for watching this video. Hopefully you enjoyed. If you did, feel free to leave a like and subscribe for more. I'll see you next time.